There's so many people right now that are doing super interesting things on a technical level with, for example, like spatial audio, multi-channel audio, and I've done some stuff around that. But I think the way I'm doing or did things is maybe a little bit more naive. Or I don't know if that's the right word. Of just like I'm just working with the stereo field, and I'm working with like I'm not working with psychoacoustics in the sense that I'm trying to like do something to prove something or to like transport someone in this literal way. It's like this um yeah, I don't know, it's more it's a little more chaotic than that, and I don't it's something that I often don't even intend to do, but it's more like a way of working where I didn't really learn to make music in a standardized way. So I always go in sort of like I'm going to the unknown, even if I'm made a million tracks. If I'm making the next one, I really think it's like uncharted territory, and it's kind of like overwhelming. So I always felt like I had to build a place for the sound, for the music to be in. Um, I've talked to people that are writers before, who will say like like in a lot of postmodern fiction, there's this kind of frame story, or this the narrator is like it, what am I trying to say? It's like when you read like mainstream fiction, it's like if you think too much about it, you're like, who's talking? Who's telling the story to whom? Finding like the root of everything like that. And I think with in a lot of fiction writers, it's like they'll question that by having like frame stories and epistolary things and stuff like that, so that like each text is grounded in a certain um, discrete viewpoint or reality or something like that. And I feel like with music, when I make music, if I just like start playing notes or start arranging percussive sounds, I'm like, well, where is this happening? I'm looking at a computer screen. I'm making or pulling out these sounds, and it just feels so arbitrary for them not to exist in a space, which is a ridiculous way to go about thinking about making music. So then I spend all this time sort of, especially in this period, when I made my first two albums, like I wanted to create spaces that that the music that I wanted to write could exist in. And once those spaces were made, it's like it was so easy to write in those spaces. You know what I mean? I don't know, like it because there's so much it's such a topic now, talking about metaverse and virtual reality and all this different stuff. Um, but I just I want that transportive aspect without getting into the boring conversations that inevitably have to come with them about, I don't know, like escapism, or what is this really grounded in, or whatever, because I don't think what I do is escapist, but it's important that it's it's like building new space into the world. You know, it's like a pocket universe, like in sci-fi, when the universe is suffering a heat death, and you split off into a pocket universe so that you can jump back in when the Big Bang happens again. Not that the Big Bang happened. We're questioning that now.
Oh, hot take.
I'm just trying to podcast the conversation up, with these. No, but like, I like things that are generative, and they can be as basic and escapist and pulpy, or highbrow and challenging in terms of form. That doesn't. That's like a different continuum for me. But first of all, like I need to like generate something. I need to add more rooms into the house of the world.
Very poetic.
Yeah.
That's and so when you're in the process of creating a new piece, you like you said, you might start with a sound or a drum track, and would you say you're actively visualizing a space or a context as the track begins to coalesce, or is it more, or maybe I'll let you hop in here before I set up some binary that doesn't actually fit.
No, it's really like I wish I could say that it was more, yeah, planned, but it's sort of generative. It's like every artist has to think about this when they talk about how they work with the things that they work with. It's like, you know, you're in a conversation with your tools or your instrument or whatever, and you start to do things and you get the feedback, and so you get into that loop, and then you can steer that loop. But no, it's not like, all right, I want to put the person in this jungle, and then we're gonna go to like a steampunk Zeppelin. Sorry, I'm gonna say that sentence again because, and then you send them to a steampunk Zeppelin, and then you know, this it's not planned like that. I'm putting a clap so you know that that was a time to edit that out. No, it's I don't know. It's just like it all starts to go together, and I don't like separate different parts of the process. It's like I'm setting up a certain type of sonic space that the instruments are sort of going to resonate within. And then this synth patch that I made that sounded totally goofy the day before, with when it's in that weird kind of resonating mode, I can play even a simple scale, but it kind of gets to me, like it hooks me. And then I write from there because I've created these conditions that kind of keep me interacting with that kind of like, let's face it, like a project file, you know? It's like in Ableton, it's a .als file. And I try to make those files that I make music in like feel alive to me. So when I sit down the next day, it's like I'm back to interacting with the file. You know? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could go deeper into that feeling of the file itself being lifelike, of maybe if life simulation is an interesting topic more generally. Like, what do you mean when the file starts to feel like it's becoming alive for you? And yeah.
Yeah, for example, I mean, I like to, there's something about me that my expertise in any given thing, it always plateaus at a certain level. It's not that I'm like creating this algorithmic game of life thing with my music. My music is a lot more simple than that. It's more about like even just designing a group of instruments that interact with each other because a couple different parameters are linked, and then one of them is drifting over time. So even when the playhead is not moving, there's some kind of like if I open up old project files from past projects, the file finishes loading, and then there's already audio coming out of the speakers just because there's these kind of like processes happening. Like nothing's being triggered, but there's a feedback loop here, and then there's like this resonant comb filter that gets harmonized here, and it creates this chord that blah blah blah. I create these messes that I write within, you know, and that's the only way I know how to do it. That's the way I learned how to do it, you know, like making weird files, and then making the music like inside that file, and then yeah, and once I realized that I could just use the same files to make different music, it was kind of like a revelation for me. I would have this project where there's just audio happening in interesting ways on its own. I finish something, I export it, I save as, and then I delete all the MIDI data, all the kind of like score information, and then work on something new that will end up sounding totally different. But it's like I'm inside the file. I'm not the guy in the room staring at the computer. I'm in there. You know what I mean? Like, you know, every half decade when they try to hype the new watershed and VR technology, and the way that they portray it is like there's someone with this like wand who's like sculpting in 3D space, like and they're like painting all this crazy graffiti, light art, Picasso. And they're just like expressing themselves, you know. That's that's how I feel when I use computers. No, not really. No, I don't feel like that at all. But I just intuitively treat it as like an environment to work in, and not as something that I'm like lording over, I guess.
And so you kind of have to convince yourself of, like, you kind of have to trick yourself that you're in the space first, and then once you're in the space, kind of created by these generative processes, and so you get to a point and you're like, oh, I'm somewhere now, and then you can start to work within that framework.
Yeah, I guess it's not that clear or it's not that literal. It's just like things start sounding good at a certain point. And when things, I can't write if it doesn't sound good first. I can't write music like with a normal synth sound or piano sound. I have to like, the sound has to sound good, and then I can turn it into music or whatever, you know. I have to make a mess big enough that it starts inspiring me to make things, I guess.
Tell me more about the part of your brain that tells you when it's starting to sound good. Are there certain heuristics you find yourself coming back to? Is it just you know it when you know it? Or, yeah, what's that kind of process like to kind of find the way and orient yourself?
It's one of those things that you only really know when you look back and see what you did. And I'm always surprised because I always feel like I'm so all over the place and I'm so inconsistent. When people tell me that they immediately know when it's something that I did, even if it's something straightforward like a remix, or if it's something, I don't know, like it's, and people do recognize that, yeah, there's something, and I guess that something was something that I was trying to do, but it was all implicit, you know. And whether it's, I don't know, like a certain burnt kind of sound, like something kind of tinged with some color or some kind of like, I don't know what it is exactly, but it ends up having a particular harmonic quality. But I don't know. Yeah, so I wish I had something good here, but yeah, yeah. I know it when I see it. Hear it.
Yeah, interesting that you say see it, because there is kind of that weird point that I think your music so often takes listeners to, where your mind's eye, your mind's ear, whatever you want to call it, you're receiving this input that you're like, okay, I'm in this kind of space. You're starting to kind of build out this space in your head, but then there's so much abstraction that's happening there at the same time. And yeah, to go back to your comment about pocket universes, it seems like the pocket universe we're in is kind of fundamentally unstable. Like, it's not like we're just in some perfectly simulated field recording. Is there anything popping up in this, or should I keep riffing? I'm not sure if I've actually given you anything to bite onto.
Yeah, I mean, I could. It's so implicit and just, yeah, it's hard to say that I plan to do anything like that. You know?
I'm wondering if it's interesting to talk about the term deconstructed club and how that kind of started to stick, and then because you mentioned earlier, like, you kind of emerged during a time when the seemed like the club scene, at least in Berlin, was much more regimented and kind of, I mean, if you go to Berghain, you know that, okay, there's going to be something at this BPM generally playing on this floor. There's going to be something a little lighter up at the Panorama Bar. And things are pretty locked in, you know. You can pretty much set your clock to it. And then if you listen to one of your mixes, or a Lodic mix, or a Kablam mix, or there are other names you can name in that scene, like maybe Total Freedom is interesting to talk about. Maybe, yeah, maybe speaking about that label, how it kind of got attached to things, and is there a value in that label? Because I think there is definitely a way that the music you guys were making felt distinct, like there was a different approach. And if deconstruction isn't the word, is there another word that fits better?
Yeah, obviously this is like a tortured subject,
Yeah.
which is fine. I can't quite remember the genesis of that word, but it's one of those words like that is disavowed by all, especially those that it applies to, like, you know, like post-internet or, um, yeah, I guess most labels like that. But yeah, I don't really know what to say because I didn't really embrace that term, and it may have even I'm trying to think of the genesis of it. It may have been a joke from one of our press releases. It may have been in the Scythians press release, which Matt Dryhurst wrote. But yeah, once people heard that word, they had a good time with it.
Oh, no, you reap what you sow.
Yeah. Which it's fine. It's all like you know, like on all our Janus posters, we had this little recycle symbol, and it said hype hate copy, and that reflects the sort of like the process of accelerated hype cycles, right? With any kind of new microgenre or new artist or new evening club night, whatever. Like first it's hyped by a certain sector, and then there's backlash against that hype, and then people copy what was going on with the initial source of the hype. And that's just like the most fundamental thing about this world of like underground electronic music, especially at that time. It was like this kind of reacting against things and then doing things in reaction that were also kind of corny, and then making people mad with the way you reacted, and then people that were mad suddenly start doing the same thing. It's like any subculture is going to have this thing happening. So that's not the part that was super interesting for me. I guess it was more about artists that were working with the sound palette that was confined to a particular thing, and then taking that sound palette and kind of opening up and seeing what was there, and then making music with it. You know, not necessarily being like, we're gonna tear down this techno imperium, because like I like techno. So it's like you can look at it as this sort of like social thing where it's like reacting, and we're doing something different and better. We're eclectic, we're post-genre, and we're leaving you in the dust, because you're the last generation, and we're 4 years younger than you, and so we're the next one. For me, that wasn't like that at all. It was just sort of like out of boredom. Just I love electronic music, and I love the infinite universe of sound of electronic music, and I just want it used in open, interesting ways. And if you can kind of like shake things up a little bit and open up these sounds, you just have to do it. So that all led to like some interesting music and some terrible music, and it was just a moment in time. That's the way things are. Like, so yeah, it's sort of like interesting, not interesting to me, I guess. Yeah. I feel like the more cryptic I am talking about this, like the better things will turn out. Because like, I don't know, it's not something I ever think about unless someone brings it up, I guess. Because it's not like it became this huge thing that people were like, people outside of the, let's say 50,000 people worldwide that follow stuff like that. Beyond that, nobody knew what the hell it was. So it wasn't. Yeah.
But I mean, 50,000, that's not a bad number in terms of, I think always when culture kind of flows, you're really going to have kind of a tighter core group of people that's like passionate and cares about something. And that core group does a lot of work, and maybe it kind of bubbles up to a wider mainstream, or maybe not.
Sure. I mean, all those sounds bubbled up into pop production and all kinds of different things, which is just totally inevitable. Yeah. And even good.
Yeah, it is interesting to like put on a new hyperpop track from the past few years and really see how the palette's expanded. Like, do you see, I mean, maybe we don't have to bring teleology into this, but do you see kind of a horizon for that? Do you think there's still sounds to be pulled in that haven't been pulled in, or does it feel like we're at an impasse?
Pulled in where?
Into just musical production.
I guess there's an infinite combination of everything. What I want is more mental bandwidth to perceive more and different sounds at the same time, which will require either some kind of medicalization or cyborgization. Like, just like a speaker has a certain bandwidth of how much sound can come out at whatever frequency before things get saturated or whatever. I wish I could hear music better. I wish I could hear sound better. I wish I could write music that could be 5 times denser than the music that we can listen to now. Because really, when you learn how to kind of like mix electronic music and write and compose and whatever, it's like, people can be aware of 3 or 4 things at a time. But what if they're aware of 20 to 30 things at the same time? No, I'm talking bullshit, but yeah, there's obviously any sound you can make it. But like, yeah, what if you could hear it more good? Sorry, I don't have a good answer. I'm sure.
No, it makes me think of I don't know the research on this with any kind of depth, but I've heard that there have been a lot of interesting studies into bird songs, especially slowing bird songs down and realizing like kind of the intricacy that's really packed in to, we hear something as like a couple chirps, but really that's a very winding, dense, information packed.
And is that because is it true that smaller animals that have faster heartbeats experience time slower, and large animals experience it faster?
I haven't heard that, but that's really interesting.
Because it would make sense for a bird if, like, their heart's probably beating like crazy, and so I would imagine a bird, and the way that they get around, they like land on telephone poles and stuff, and they're listening to these chirps, and they're hearing every micro articulation of timbre and their rival birds chirp. There must be a perceptual, like a subjective experience of time that's slower. I think I've read that dogs, maybe it's 50% more slowed down than for us, because animals have different reaction times to us. So yeah, I wonder if it goes back to what I was saying about it's more about the listener than what we can make with the tools. It's like, if we could hear like a bird hears, would that entail slowing down time? What drugs or sort of augmentations would we need to be able to hear like a bird? I'm more interested in that than like thinking about like what crazy genre is going to come next. But so I'm also not seriously interested in that, because it's the first time I've ever thought about it.
But it's a fun thought. It's
I want to hear like a bird in slow motion.
Yeah, there's. What was it you mentioned about heartbeats? Because I think also the heartbeat kind of has this core role in how we process dance music. So it's, I don't know, there's an interesting kind of constellation of thoughts there.
Yeah, because I don't know where I read this theory or why I believe this, but I do. But, imagine like an elephant or like a big old bear. Their heart's beating probably pretty slow, like maybe, I don't know, 40 BPM. And then, the human range is what, 50 to 100 of a healthy person? I don't know. But then they say, like, in dance music, like, there are certain tempos that, like 120 BPM would be like a heartbeat of an excited person, maybe. But yeah, it's funny that we got here, because you originally asked about that song that I made in 2003, Individuals, which I put on my SoundCloud last year. And I can kind of remember at that time, I think I was like 16, 17, something, where I was listening to a lot of really fast music. The Aphex Twin album Drux had just come out, and I was listening to a lot of like breakcore and drum and bass and what they call drill and bass, another horrible genre term. But I was listening to like very fast music that also had some kind of like harmonic or melodic kind of complexity to it. And if you weren't focusing on it, it sounded like really like a din, like a horrible raucous noise. But then if you were like caffeinated and focused on listening to it, it had a profound effect, So like I was really interested in fast music. I totally lost that. I'm just wondering if I should get into fast music again, because when you does fast music make you think faster? Does it make you I don't know. But yeah, I really like that idea that like you can open up time, and if you're more aware and focused of something, then subjectively time is slowing down for you, and your decisions can be completely different, and you can react faster and things like that. So yeah, I think music should do that.
And I mean, also just the musical artifact itself is open to being sped up and slowed down too.
That's true. Yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm curious how all those old drum and bass and gabber songs sound slowed down 30%.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's whole genres. I mean, like lento violento is like slowed down, hardcore gabber. But yeah, it's the pitch shifting algorithms get better year on year. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder. Is there a question here, or am I just riffing?
You can riff till you get there.
Yeah.
You're the editor.
True,
You're listening
yeah.
right now, tomorrow, and you're like, all right, what am I going to cut? What am I going to leave? So you're powerful right now.
Yeah, no,
You can say something really dumb right now that will never be heard by anyone.
No, it'll find its way out for sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's no escape. Yeah, I can riff a bit. Yeah, I mean, I guess we can also take stock a bit here, too. Are there... I don't know. I feel like I'm in the RPG with the dialogue tree, and it's like, oh, this is okay, but
get out of that.
We could go over here, yeah.
Get out of the linearity,
Yeah, I mean, we want to get rhizomatic with it, for sure.
Exactly.
And, I wanted to mention... or ask about that with individuals. Is that a reference to Deleuze and the Notes on a Society of Control specifically, or did it come from another place?
Given I made that when I was like 17, and I would have had no idea
Cool.
about any of that. But can you explain what I did on accident?
So Deleuze, I don't know if this was the first time he used the term, but in this essay he wrote towards the end of his life called Notes on a Society of Control, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he basically says that we've kind of reached a stage where you don't think of subjects as individuals, like a single person who can't be divided, like the core unit, but you think of people as individuals, where certain aspects of maybe it's like your sleep cycle, maybe it's the media you watch, you can be subdivided further. So the individual human subject is no longer the atom of government. Governance actually can kind of burrow deeper and regulate just certain aspects of your personality, was kind of what, if I'm remembering the essay correctly.
It's specifically talking about governance.
Like yeah.
There's like biological, and there's sort of psychological.
The point about individuals comes up kind of in a broader framework of talking about moving from kind of Foucault's classic discipline and punish, everything's a prison society of, okay, we have these people, how do we arrange them and control them, to the society, I think it's societies of power is what he calls that framework, and then the society of control is where you're free to move wherever you want. There are seemingly no limits put on you until suddenly there is a limit. And you don't really see it coming. Like you're taking a taxi to the next city, and then something shows up on your app, and the driver's like, "Oh, I'm not allowed to drive you here," and just kicks you out. That sense of kind of contained, like you feel like you're infinitely free, but the boundary is just a little bit bigger than you can see.
You're not the serf that has a very clear relationship to the Lord, and everything is really explicit, and it's more like these realms of life are like segmented, and then different aspects of you can only access certain things in certain ways, and that's a totally different type of control. I don't know how I named that track because it was 20 years ago. I have no idea. Sorry.
Fun coincidence.
I feel like I'm killing you with my bad answers.
No, they're good.
Feel free to go out on a limb and talk about anything you want to talk about, though.
Um, okay, maybe this is too niche. So you did an interview with Resident Advisor a few years ago, and they took a few photos of you in the studio.
Hmm.
And one thing that they did that I wish would happen more often, they also, I think, took a photo of your bookshelf at the time.
Yeah, I was kind of mortified when that happened.
Yeah?
'Cause I felt so pretentious.
Hmm.
I didn't have a bookcase, and I was living near Gurlitzer Park at the time, and I had my like computer and this crappy desk and just like stupid books, and I don't know. Let me think of a better answer. Um, yeah, it felt like I was happier that they took a picture of the inside of my computer
Hmm.
because that felt more like a mission statement. Because especially at that time, like usually these artist features would be pictures of all these like vintage synths and this kind of thing, and I was really just this like, you know, guy on a computer, and I enjoyed embracing that.
Hmm. Have you come around to synths at all, or is that still part of the mission statement that everything happens kind of within Ableton?
No, there's no real mission statement. I use other things besides Ableton now too. No, it's not really like that. It's just first of all, I never had any money. I never like could buy things, and then I could, and then so like I bought an Octatrack, and then I sold it, and then I bought another one a year later, and then I sold it. At a certain point, I just like when I set up the environment that I'm going to work in, I use you know two different DAWs, and then I have synths like software synthesizers that I downloaded 15 years ago that I still use, and but I keep up with new stuff. I get new stuff, but it's not like a mission statement so much as sort of like I'm not interested in those classic sounds. Obviously, you can do way more even with a 20 or 30-year-old synth than just replicating a nostalgic classic sound. But for me, like, I never got super into synthesis, even though like when I make music, I make patches and da da da. I also make presets. I make combinations of presets, but the sound itself reaches its kind of uniqueness through the way it's processed more than the actual original kind of starting parameters.
So fundamentally, would you say, like, what percentage of a typical track, if you can even describe a typical track that you do, is samples, and what percentage is something you've synthesized? Like, is it all starting from a base of samples that then get processed, or
It's
like generally?
it's just kind of all of the above, but it has a lot to do with this kind of like building up just weird processing chains and then cross processing things and having sounds that wouldn't normally be related being put on the kind of the same bus and having reactions to each other, using envelope followers to like have different sounds, control parameters of kind of unexpected other sounds to create this cohesive feeling that the instruments exist together even if they're really different sounds. Just as like this is a really basic example, but like when I teach, I talk about this. Like imagine you have like a sort of atmospheric synth pad sound, and it's playing just one note, and then whenever a certain sound or instrument or drum sample or whatever other instrument appears, it controls some gate that opens up two more notes on top of the single note on that original synth sound, so that whenever, let's say it's a clap, so whenever there's a clap, the gate opens up, and so suddenly instead of like a single note drone, it's a chord, but just for the duration of the clap, or maybe there's some decay to it. That's a really simple thing to do, but if you start working like that, suddenly all these disparate random sounds, like one sound could become coming from some generic sample pack, and another could be like a synth preset thing. But you create these relationships, and then suddenly like you have this sort of like I don't know, this like apparatus, this like kind of like organic thing that's like interacting. And but then when you listen, I would like to think that like these disparate objects, these sound objects, they sit together in a space together, or I don't know if it's a space, but it's they're consistent. They share the same world somehow. Yeah. And that's just through these little techniques of making things interrelate in kind of subtle ways. Like I like to think like, instead of thinking of things in just purely mixing ways, like, oh, how do I make it so that this synth is nice and clear next to this other sound that inhabits a similar frequency space? It's like, well, what if these two sounds, if they get too close, they kind of burn each other? So when the volume threshold of both reaches a certain something, there's a little bit of distortion with resonance and a little bit of spring delay or whatever. And then suddenly you're starting to think about mixing in this way that's not purely about expressing the idea of a musical score. It's like mixing becomes this way of creating relationships that lead you to unexpected ways of working when you finally finish the track as a composition. So I get kind of obsessive about making these relationships between sounds. Yeah. So the stock sounds, I always like to think that I could just start with really basic sounds, and then the way that they're processed creates the interest that I might have in them. Yeah.
And would you say it's fair to say like chance plays a pretty big role in this process? Like, how surprised do you want to be or need to be when you're in the studio and working on something?
Yeah, and this is a subject where I also have a lot of pet peeves. I have a lot of pet peeves. But when people talk about sort of generative or algorithm music, it's like this really boring 90s Brian Eno kind of like ambient music thing of like infinite music, and or the listener can determine how the music, like when you talk about chance in music, you kind of fall into these kind of tropes. For me, chance is more about my interaction with the sounds. So like when there's an element of chance, it keeps me from being understimulated when I'm sitting at a computer making music.
Yeah, wonder if subconsciously, as most of us listen to music, we're kind of trying to figure out the rules of the world we've been dropped into. And with so much generative music, it feels like you kind of arrive at the rules very quickly. Like something that you quote unquote like didn't expect could happen, but it's already kind of contained within this wider framework of like, oh yeah, he's pulling in some track that's, maybe it's just a radio frequency that'll drop random things in, maybe it's some synth that kind of modulates itself in this way.
Yeah.
And even if you're not consciously breaking it down mechanically, like if someone's not as familiar with music production, they still pretty quickly generally are like, oh yeah, I kind of have an intuitive sense of what's going on, and then you check out. Would you say is it important in your practice that people aren't able to kind of get a sense of that world? Or
Yeah, it's funny, this reminds me of there was this art writer when I was a student in New York, Tom Moody, and he wrote a lot about net art, and then this kind of second wave of net art that was happening at that time. He would describe certain types of media art as being like A plus B equals C as a criticism. And that always stuck with me because it's exactly what you're saying. Like when you can implicitly learn the rules of something so quickly, but then there's still a lot of hand waving on top. I don't know. It's the difference between the difference between that and something that can spark almost infinite interest in you. Like when you experience, whether it's a film or whatever it is, you know, it can just on the outside be almost the exact same work, but when the rules are so explicit and easily learned in the beginning with one thing versus the other thing, which seems to suggest some kind of infinity, not an infinity of like a random number generator, but an infinity of, I don't know, there's a sense of the mysterious even in certain minimalist art and certain artwork that starts with defined rules, but there's always this factor of it's not A plus B equals C, it's A plus B equals, something that's not even an alphabet, and I guess I always look for that when it comes to my own taste or preferences of something. It can be something really, even something having the aesthetic of technology, like even like a lot of like in the history of electronic music, there's a lot of stuff that's like has this really techie atmosphere and this kind of like retro futurism, or seems retro for us now. Um, but some of it has this kind of like conjuring aspect, and it's this it's the hardest thing to put in words, and we could be here all day, but it's like something. It's an X factor. It's something that transcends its parameters. And when you make music on the computer, especially, like people that are obsessed with like analog electronic music gear, they're obsessed. They'll talk about how, oh, this old thing, if it's on too long, it overheats, and then the tuning, wavers or something like that. Which I totally understand is like a point of fascination. But when you're working in a digital space, it's like you have a known set of parameters. You're not talking about circuit boards that were made in the 80s. You have a known set of parameters. And being able to find that unknown in that space where everything is logical and everything is when you hit Command S and you save it, it's saved to a file, which is just a string of text. But still, something can be in that creates a pocket universe. To me, that's the only thing I really care about. It's this. No matter how minimalist or how conceptual or procedural or whatever your technique is, there's always an open window somewhere where something's coming in that you can't explain. Yeah. So it's.
Are there certain techniques in the studio you'll do, or certain processes that you kind of keep in your back pocket to help you find that window when you're working through something?
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you don't really realize until later, and you look back that, oh, I'm doing the same thing quite often, and I didn't really realize this until I started to occasionally teach. Like every once in a while, I'll do like a workshop somewhere, or like I've taught in the past, and looking back at what you do, because I always had this sort of inferiority complex where I'm like, oh, I'm sort of half-assing this weird thing that I do, and some people like it, but if they knew how simplistic the way I work was, they would be like disappointed or something. But then I realized that I do certain things that it's not about randomness. It's not about unpredictability. It's not about generativity, because being generative, I mean, you could program something that creates an infinite amount of music that would have enough like change and dynamics that it would be music. So it's not about that. It's like about creating the conditions where it's not about you create the conditions where something interesting happens and then you record that, and you put a frame around that. It's like you create the conditions where something unexpected happens and it provokes a response in you as the artist to react in a certain way. And maybe that reaction is you write a really straightforward piece of music. Maybe the reaction is something more different. Maybe, but it's about creating those conditions and responding to those conditions and modifying those conditions. So it's like, it's not just the text file that contains all the parameters of the project that you just saved. It's the interaction that happened with you as a subject and your tool.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a need for a certain kind of contingency, like, or a specific thing. How to put it? Like a statistically unlikely outcome that's somehow perfect.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that resonate or?
Yeah, because I don't know. Like, I feel like what I do is idiosyncratic and personal, but it's also out of my hands in a lot of ways. So like, what does that mean? Like, I'm not techie. I'm not doing things that are in the canon of like media art or sound art or things like that, it's like I feel like what I do is super super personal, but I'm also engaging with my unconscious. I'm engaging with the potentiality of sounds that I don't quite understand while I'm working with them, but then in their recorded form, they instantly bring me a certain feeling or memory or place or image or idea. But it's not that I set the conditions and I press record. It's a lot of it is happening and quote unquote being processed like in my unconscious as I'm working. And I think that's true for every artist. But different artists like see it in different ways, or different artists don't see it, but it still crops up in what they do. You know. Yeah.
I'm thinking it could be fun to try and jump into a couple of your songs and.
Sure.
Here it is. This is Piteous Gate from your 2015 album of the same name. Speaking about space, what kind of space were you visualizing when you made this song? And also, I wanted to mention the title of Piteous Gate, which, when I was reading through Gene Wolfe's Shadow of the Torturer, which you recommended before we met for the podcast, that's also a location within this novel.
That's true. Yeah. Yes. This kind of opening. It's not even like a full-fledged piece of music. It's really like this kind of intro. But like going back to Deconstructed Club, like I was using sort of sample packs and sound libraries and different ways of using synths to like approximate this this melodic style of basically hardstyle music. And so when the sort of melodic parts come in halfway through, they're written with triplets in their timing. So and then the way that it has this kind of like counterpoint feel. So like, yeah, I was like really deeply invested in like, you know, studying hardstyle because it wasn't a culture I grew up with, but that way of writing melodies in counterpoint, to me, it reminded me of medieval music. And just thinking of hardstyle as like, it's kind of rooted in like the Low Countries and the Netherlands and I mean around Northern Europe and around the world really. But there was something so medieval about the sound to me, and yeah, somehow it just kind of fascinated me to like take that kind of harmonic content and that kind of like melody writing, but then instead of having it in like a functional kind of like track that you'd play at a club. It's really playing in this kind of like chaotic space, but like you said, that there's also like this placid element to it. So is it like a, I don't know, it's like a bustling marketplace where like the you know the band of brigandines are coming in and shaking down the merchants, or I don't know. That's like I just there's something elusive about that sound, and learning how to write it myself, and then place it into a different context. It suddenly like created such a story for me. Like it felt really narrative. So yeah, that's how that happened. And then with the title, I mean, I was deep in Book of the New Sun lore at that time, obviously, and you know the PD escape moment in those books is at the end of book 1, and it represents this like this sort of blank space between book 1 and 2, where it's one of the few things with those books where there are many theories about what happened, but there's no like canonical theory. Whereas with everything else, like, you know, people since the 90s on Usenet and stuff have like mapped out every reference and every recurring kind of character and idea and symbol and everything.
For a bit of context before we get too
Sure.
deep in, could you just briefly mention Gene Wolfe and the Book of the New Sun for listeners who might not be familiar?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Gene Wolfe was, he's considered to be like a new wave science fiction writer in the 70s and 80s, and he kept working until his death a couple of years ago. But Book of the New Sun was sort of like, his magnum opus that came out in the early 80s that was, I mean, we keep getting into things that are hard to describe, but no, it was just like a really, when I discovered that series, and I've reread it a couple of times now, it became super important to me, just because there's this level of complexity that's not arbitrary complexity, and it's also complexity that deals in tropes, because he was writing using all these tropes from the pulp science fiction that he would have read as a young man, kind of like postmodern literary fiction, but also a lot of modernist fiction, and it all comes together in this sort of like melange. But it's not like, you know, you're reading about the day of a university professor in New England, and it's 900 pages, and it's filled with all this crazy stuff. You know, there's like monsters and aliens, and so it's like it's somehow, for me, in terms of like my taste and my preferences, it's like it's dealing with certain things that would be referred to as low culture, or kind of like pulp, or things that sort of excite you in a way that's not highbrow, you know, but it's also something so rich and structurally complex, and complex on the prose level. So I just became fascinated with it because there's nothing like it, and
I also wanted to bring in the influence of the medieval, because it's a really interesting book. I mean, I read the first 4 books on your recommendation, and you start off like you're just dropped into a torturer's dungeon, and there's a little apprentice torturer learning the tools of his trade. And so as you're kind of dropped into this world, you're saying, okay, some kind of dark medieval fantasy maybe, and you're kind of coming in with those, like, acclimated by those genre tropes. And then you're reading and things seem a bit strange here and there. And I think this isn't too big of a spoiler for anyone who might be interested in reading, but there's a certain point as you're kind of reading through these early sections of the book where you go, oh shit, this is a rocket ship. We're inside of a rocket ship right now. And there's this really, and maybe I'm pulling on too many threads here, but I also want to tie it into this idea of speculative medievalism. On that bookshelf that you posted, that was posted as part of the interview, there was a really interesting little book called Speculative Medievalism that I found online and read a couple of the essays to get a sense of what that was. There's something about that combination of terms that I think is really central to understanding Wolfe, but is also feels like there's a kind of kinship in your music. This kind of continuum between the sense of the medieval and these medieval tropes with kind of mixed with futurism. And yeah, that's one of the kind of fantastic things about the Book of the New Sun, that it's this science fiction epic that feels like a knight's journey or even religious allegory at certain points. And these genre tropes that we're often used to thinking of as distinct from each other all kind of collapse into this soup. And that kind of collapsing of understood tropes and temporal relationships, I think also it runs through your music. And I kind of dropped a lot on you there. If there's
No,
anything
but there's something there, like, because a lot of authors have gone about this task of deconstructing tropes of a certain genre or a certain canon. And so that happens in a certain way and in a certain historical context with certain results. But with these books, it's like there is these sort of quote unquote deconstructions of these tropes, whether it's of like a fight with an alien in a pulp science fiction novel, whether it's like the trope of significance to a Christian person or whatever. But it's not that like you take apart the pieces and you just lay them there. It's like there's a new whole that's built from the parts that doesn't feel arbitrary. There's nothing like, I was about to say it's not like a trippy dream sequence, but there's like many trippy dream sequences in the book. But usually you expect like these sort of like psychedelic moments or these sort of moments that are transcendental to just sort of be hand waving on the part of an author, or to introduce a symbol, or to explain something about the inner workings of the character. But in these books, it's like, no, they relate to like the history and eschatology of the universe, and they're all every detail is super important. So I guess that mentality of being open to what you kind of steal from and take from and are inspired by, but not in a way that's just purely destructive or showing that you, the deconstructor, are superior to them. It's more like you're like reinvesting these elements with something vital, and when I was writing music at that time, it was like, I guess this goes to why I was always uncomfortable with the deconstructed club term, because usually it means like, yeah, we're effing S up to make a point and then to do this or that, But for me, it was like, well, the things I care about are so divergent from each other. They're so all over the place, and they don't really add up to anything cohesive. But what if I have to go about this task of like making them cohesive? Like I always had this sort of sentence running in my mind. I remember even when I was super young of everything I like is part of the same world. And so like that world that you create unconsciously through your choices in terms of taste and what you choose to take in and what you end up caring about, like the way they exist in your unconscious is they exist quite easily in your unconscious. There's no it's not that things don't match. It's like they have to match because they're there, And so to take all these disparate elements and to create something semi-cohesive or having some kind of structure, whether it's narrative or whether it's something musical, it's that challenge to do that in a way that's not purely destructive or demonstrative of your intellectual superiority to the things that you're digesting and spitting back out. So like I'm inspired by a lot of things that like, maybe are part of what would be called trash culture or whatever, but I'm not like just collaging that to make a point about society or something. It's like everything I care about is so important to me. Like everything I like is part of the same world, and it has to be. And so when I put something back into the world, it has to like feel as cohesive as it feels in my dreams,
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is that feeling that if you can perceive it, it's already kind of coherent into something. Like otherwise, it would just be noise, and we wouldn't even be able to consciously process it or talk about it.
Hmm.
Like,
Or it's like the essay you sent me last night,
oh yeah,
where the dream of imagining the molecular structure of, I forget what it was.
oh, and just for listeners,
Yeah.
this is the Kekulé problem by Cormac McCarthy.
So do you want to explain the calculated problem real quick?
Sure. Yeah, basically, McCarthy is writing about this very recurrent trope, where, or trope is the wrong word. I mean, it's things that repeatedly happen. It's not happening in literature, but the basically repeatedly scientists have had their breakthroughs in the forms of basically visionary experiences or dreams. Most famously, he talks about this, I think, either a chemist or molecular physicist who was trying to figure out the structure of a molecule for a long time, and then he goes to sleep and he has a dream of a snake biting its own tail, and he wakes up and says, oh, the structure I've been looking for is a ring. And so McCarthy kind of starts with this story and kind of gradually picks apart, or not picks apart, gradually McCarthy goes through and teases out potential implications of how the unconscious works with images and then relates to the more recently developed parts of our brain that use language.
So in the unconscious, the snake and the, perfectly drawn circle, there's no like boundaries between them in the way they exist in the unconscious, because obviously it's like it's not a structured space in the way that we think of it. So those combinations can happen. Um, so just to connect it with what I was saying earlier, it's like, yeah, of course it's going to be cohesive because I say it's cohesive because I did it in a cohesive way. I hope, it's like, it's about being honest to what comes out of you and what comes out of your interaction with the tool you're using, and trusting that unconscious part of yourself when you're working as well. Because as soon as I start to be too didactic with what I'm doing, it's closing off the unconscious, you know. And I don't want to be too woo woo and like make it seem like what I'm doing is something visionary. But I think every artist is working in a visionary way. How much of it there is explicable or not is, you're still opening up a channel to something that the ancients knew about, but up until 100 years ago, we didn't really consider.
Do you feel that kind of tension in your own work between like the kind of intuitive and then the intuitive aspects of your own work and then your ability to kind of communicate what you're doing verbally?
Yeah, because I always feel like I'm disappointing by being sort of anti-didactic or being kind of like I would never want to be the person that's like purposefully obfuscating something to create a certain expectation in the listener or something like that, because I'm really not like that. And like in other areas of my life, like I'm a pretty logical person, you know. But in this space, what was the question again? The tension between
The tension between the intuitive aspects of your practice and then just the experience of communicating what you're doing to other people with language or even to yourself.
yeah, I mean, I feel like I end up falling into this kind of woo woo as a way, as sort of like a scaffold to kind of like have some kind of explanation. But I'm also not super woo woo. Um, I just, I don't know, like I'm always surprised just to be alive. I'm surprised about everything all the time,
Yeah, life
you
is
know?
crazy.
And I'm not into drugs. I'm not a stoner, but I'm like, I'm like that guy. I'm like always surprised to be here, you know? And it has a lot to do with the way I grew up and stuff, but I just, um, I can explain other things about reality in like a really systematic way, and like, you know, I like to read about things and understand things, and I love hearing from people that like are good at doing some particular thing, some kind of technique or whatever it is. You know, I could go on YouTube and watch people like you know, building their own deck at their lake house or whatever, or like rewilding their backyard to attract a certain type of bird. I could watch that 40-minute video over lunch and be very, very happy. But once I get to music, I'm just at a complete loss. And I'm not even like a big music person. I make music. I don't follow a lot of music. I don't like a lot of music. And it's not a judgment thing, because I just like really specific things, and I do what I do. But I can't just like show up anywhere and just vibe out. Like I'm really hyper specific, because I just want to get to that thing. I want to get to that thing that leads me back to my surprise at being alive. And some music does it, and some unlikely music does it, you know. And some music that you think would do it doesn't do it. And, you know
Yeah,
what I mean?
where are some surprising places you found that feeling?
Even just like in a lot of like pretty standard electronic music, there'll be like a certain way that some synth plays a really simple 3-note part, and there's a certain type of reverb to it, and it's mixed in a certain way, and I can't stop thinking about it. And so no matter what kind of track or whatever it is, I'm just like, because of the way that sound was, like, that track has entered my world. It's part of the everything I like is part of the same world thing, you know.
Are things you don't like also part of your world? Even
Well, that's the reverse side. This the dangerous side, because you know I can be kind of like a curmudgeon sometimes and focus too much on negative things, and but that never enters, like, it can enter as a motivation. Like sometimes I think it's important for people that want to do something to encounter a lot of stuff that they think is bad. Like if you're a writer, I think it's important to not just read like the 20th century canon and just only be of that. I think it's important to also like go out and find things that like surprise you. Also reading important canonical things and deciding that you don't like them is super important. And with music, like sometimes I listen to something and it strikes me as bad in like a really moral way. Like this is wrong, especially if it's played in a public place or something or whatever. Or it's just like there's a pretense about it that strikes me as so false. And in my kind of like teenage mind, it strikes me as evil. You know what I mean? So it becomes this sort of like motivational thing of like, how can I be the opposite of that? And that goes back to like the kind of teenage identity formation thing when it comes to taste. So yeah, like having a negative approach sometimes is important to actually get things out the door, to motivate yourself. But not as something to hold on to, and not as something to be a sort of mission statement, or to be like, I'm tearing down this edifice and I'm replacing it with this true thing. You know, it's like, I don't take artists very seriously, and I don't take art very seriously per se, but I also take it incredibly seriously. But artists I just see as such clownish figures, including myself, and I wish more people had this attitude to artists of like, I don't know, just like, people should doubt themselves more in some ways, and then like have incredible like righteous conviction when they're making their work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then you step away, and then you can't hold on to that. You know. Yeah.
I mean, it also brings to mind jester's privilege.
Visage.
Or, oh no, have you heard this? I feel like it was floating around as a meme recently. That the jester in the old medieval court is the
'Cause
one person who
he could
gets
say
to
everything to the king.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, like that's artists. That's the way artists have been seen like throughout all of human history as being like a low profession. You know what I mean? And I don't know. I think that's like when it comes to veneration of artists, um, you have to be a jester sometimes to like to be that kind of gateway to something happening. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, I don't like music that sounds like someone making music. I don't like to listen to something and think like, oh, there's this person that's really trying to do something and they're not quite getting there. But if you don't understand someone's motives for making music, and it seems like they've transcended some of their own subjectivity, even if they're making something really subjective and personal, that's where you find great things. Yeah, so be the jester.
Yeah, it does seem like we often have breakthroughs when we're just playing or when you're midway through a joke.
Hmm.
Do you ever laugh listening to your own music?
Yeah, I don't know, like I think my music is really funny. Just because, um, it's always traumatic for an artist to read what other people like think of what you're doing, even if it's positive. Like, for example, when people write about something I've done and they say that's like a dystopian, like beatscape with dark blah blah. It's like, I don't know. Like, I always forget that people think my music is dark, just because, I mean, there's something tortured about it, but it's not like this glacial, serious, heavy thing. Like a lot of it's like circus music.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you never know how people are gonna slot things in. But I don't think I make dystopian music. I think we live in a beautiful world. We can go into like podcast stuff and talk about morning routines and
I am trying to think if there are any like things of that kind of genre trope that
you
are
should
actually useful.
deconstruct and deconstruct podcasting. Let's do this.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, advice for young people is always a funny one.
Yeah. I'm always hyper conscious about being pompous or something when it comes to giving advice.
Yeah.
Because like I never like asked it for advice for anyone, and then I did things in a certain way, and there are some people that appreciated that, and some people that didn't. But it's like when I teach, especially, it's always funny for me because I figured out a way that I can teach where it's relevant for the whole group. You know what I mean? So it's not like I have nothing sort of programmatic to say about music. I'm not even trained as a musician or composer or anything like that. But it's more about building up the tools that you're gonna use and reuse and evolve, and people forget about that. That like they need to build their library of techniques, even as a starting point. Even if it's just like some weird thing that you do, just embrace it and save it as a preset and just tuck it away. you can't start from scratch all the time, you know.
Another question that pops to mind is something that might be fun as a recurrent little thing to throw in at the end. What's a piece of advice or just an interesting bit of knowledge you've gained from doing what you do that you think a non-artist would benefit knowing?
That's interesting. There's such a conversation about like creativity. Like for example, like I was just listening to some like Rick Rubin interviews because he has a new book out about creativity, and so like you know you often see like you know business travelers at the airport reading a book about creative thinking or like so this kind of cult of creativity was such a thing in these past decades. But to think about it more like I don't know because I never like tried to be like an artist. It just happened. And a lot of people try to be an artist but don't end up making any art. And so I don't know what would you say to someone who's not an artist and doesn't intend to be an artist but that you've learned from creating art. Um, that's a big one, man. Is what you're doing um, creating more space in the world? Is it creating the pocket universe? Is it? You know what I mean? I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you, man. Yeah, I don't know because I don't know if I've learned anything. I feel like everything I've done is on accident.